Hi, everybody. We'll give just a few seconds here to let everybody get in. Welcome to session IC 36 titled Functional Mobility Assessment Registry Data Updates. Our presenters today are Mark Schmeler and Tricia Dowd, and I will be providing the CEU code at the end via kind of speaking it out loud, as well as providing it in the chat box. And feel free to provide any questions through the chat box today. We will be monitoring that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark and Tricia.
Thank you, Becky. I'll say welcome. My name is Mark Schmeler. Some of you may have seen me this morning. It's a pleasure to give this presentation on the functional mobility assessment. I'm sure many of you have heard it before. It's not so much a repeat, but rather we keep providing updates on the data as the data set grows and we do more analytics. Greg Packer and Tyler from VGM are not able to make it. They're on their way here to Pittsburgh. On our end here, we also have Rich Schein and Dave Pramana, who have also been doing a lot of work on this project as well. But with that, I'd like to let Tricia Dowd introduce herself and tell you all what she does related to this project. Let's go ahead, Tricia.
Yeah, well, I'm Tricia Dowd. I am the FMA Quality Assurance Coordinator with US Rehab. I handle everything FMA on our end of things. That includes the website portal for the FMA training, and also doing follow-ups with our team here with US Rehab with, clients completing the functional mobility assessment.
Great, thanks. So yes, you'll notice here when we get into the data that I have to acknowledge Tricia and her team. We have well over 10,000 cases in the registry at this point. Just points of disclosure that I'm one of the developers of the FMA, and we have been working under contract with VGM to receive data, or US Rehab to receive de-identified data associated with the quality assurance component of what they're doing to provide the analytics, report those back to the organizations and suppliers, clinics that are participating. And then also we look at the data from a research perspective to look at trends and what's happening in what we do. Learning objectives are pretty straightforward. They're in the presentation. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Today, what I'd really like to talk about, or what we'd like to talk about, is where we are with the data set and what the data is starting to trend. Some of what we're going to be sharing today is still unscientific, I guess, in that it hasn't gone through peer review, but we feel it's more than important to discuss it at this point, but it is getting there. And as I mentioned, first of all, our registry is at 10,000 cases. These are people who are using complex rehab technology. And I'll show you in a bit what that looks like as far as follow-up. But one of the things that we've been able to pretty much show now beyond kind of a reasonable doubt that when an ATP is involved in the provision of CRT, we see much better outcomes. Not only do we see increased FMA scores, or what we might call person-reported outcomes or satisfaction, but we're also trending in the direction that when an ATP is involved, there's higher quality equipment. And if we look at some of the health outcomes like falls and pressure sores, hospital readmits, those are actually going down. So the argument people say, well, duh, how come we have to have all this data to prove the obvious? And I couldn't disagree more with, I could agree with that also, but we live in a world that's data-driven. Healthcare is data-driven. It doesn't matter, us as providers, suppliers, talk about how good we are and what we do. You've got to have science to back it up, which is why we've been on this venture for quite some time. I've certainly been involved in this project most of my career. And so, like I said, what we're seeing now in trending of data, satisfactions are going up from baseline to follow-up. That's after people get a new device. We're seeing the outcomes we would expect, such as fewer falls, pressure sores, and hospital readmissions. And we'll share some of those findings with you as we go through the presentation. So those of you not familiar with the functional mobility assessment, it's just a really simple what we call person-centered or consumer-centered health. Some areas of health we'll call it a patient-centered satisfaction, but it's really getting information from the user as far as what they view as important, and are they getting what they expect out of their assistive technology, in this case complex CRT, and it's doing what we intended to do. So this was developed going back to the 90s. I won't go into the details there, but it is a validated tool. We've done lots of analytics on it. We know that it's valid. We know that it's sensitive to change, and we know that it's repeatable. It's basically 10 questions about, my current means of mobility allows me to carry out my daily routine, meets my comfort needs, meet my health needs. I can operate it. I can reach for things, get under counters and reach things off the shelves, transfer in and out of it, do my personal care, get around indoors, get around outdoors, and use transportation. Those are the top 10 things. When we went early on, we wanted a questionnaire that wouldn't have more than 10 questions, just to keep it simple. Those were the things that people who use wheelchairs said were most important to them. They answer these questions on a scale of 1 to 6. 1 is completely disagree, 6 is completely agree. That would be 100%. So you're going to get a total composite score out of 60 if they answer all the questions. Who can administer this tool? Well, anyone can. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes. In some instances, a person can just fill it out themselves on a tablet or a piece of paper, or it could be a customer service person, pre-appointment. It could be a follow-up appointment. Tricia will talk a little bit about this as we get into the presentation. Now, associated with the questionnaire, so that the questionnaire tells us what the person's satisfaction is, but there's important information we need to know about the people filling this out, so that when we run the analytics, we get a sense of really trying to answer some questions of, does this intervention result in different outcomes based on different variables? And there's a lot of variables in what we call this uniform data set. And that's a minimum set of consistent variables collected across all of the people in the registry, so that we can compare one group of people to another, knowing what the differences are. So in some research or databases now, in healthcare, we call these biomarkers, things that are important to know, like hospital admissions, disease processes, anything that you could think of that would be an outcome or an identifier important to the cause or the purpose of what we're trying to look at. So when we look at our uniform data set from a demographics perspective, we know the person's year of birth, we know their gender, ethnicity, what their primary diagnosis is, the year of the onset. We know the first 3 numbers of their zip code, and we know their payer type. So these are just identifiers. And what's important to know here is when this data comes to us at the University of Pittsburgh, this is all we know about the people. We don't know their name. We don't know their date of birth. There's no way for us to re-identify who they are. And that's a pretty common practice in most registries now. We call it a database. Other people call it a registry, but this is basically, we call the Complex Rehab Technology Registry of people that we all work with. So we also collect information about what type of device they're using, and we break this down into groupings. I'll show you that, the manufacturer, what accessories are on it that are pretty common ones, what kind of cushion they're using. We use the Medicare definitions here, the HCPCS codes, how old the device is, how much repair or maintenance has been done on the chair. And one was probably a more recent publication that I'll talk a little bit about, but there's a session tomorrow about, is there a difference between devices provided by ATPs, devices that are not provided by ATPs? And yes, there is a difference. When we look at health and safety, part of the UDS is falls. How often have you fallen in the last 3 months? And there's a very specific way to answer that question. So it's not subjective. We keep this all very uniform. It's kind of yes, no, categorical data. I'm not saying that subjective is not important. That's important clinically, and we do continue to collect that information. So by no means is this uniform data set replacing all of the documentation we do in the clinic. This is just a portion of what we add to our documentation in the clinic, is what we call basically the objective measure. So we've heard sessions where they talk about, it's great to have subjective stuff. And I certainly find that important myself as a clinician, but when it comes to doing research, you need to have objective things, standardized objective measures. So from an activity participation factors and of the UDS is how many hours a day you use your device, what's your living situation, how often do you leave your home in a week, your employment status, and what type of transportation are you using. So that's basically the FMA UDS as a questionnaire. I'm going to turn it over to Tricia now, and she can talk about how this plays out from a practical perspective.
Definitely. On the US rehab side of things, what we do here is once that time 1 is completed by a clinic or a supplier, they log into our website portal. They submit that information. That's what we call time 1. That's the intake demographic form and the 10 question FMA form. Once that's submitted, they'll log back in. They'll enter the delivery information once that client receives their new device. And then once our database receives that delivery information, it starts the clock to schedule the time 2 follow-up, which is completed by us here at US Rehab. So US Rehab will continue to follow up for the time 2, the 21-day post-delivery. The time 3, we'll do another follow-up at 90 days. Time 4, 6 months. Times 5, 12 months. Time 6, time 7, and so on are the annual follow-ups. And we'll continue to do an annual follow-up up until the point where maybe the 5-year mark hits. I just had 2 clients recently. We got to the 5-year mark, and so I reached out to the provider, and they're already getting another eval set up for a new device. And unfortunately, some people pass away. You know, the FMA is voluntary. It's not mandatory, obviously. We can't force someone to complete it. So we do have people that opt out. They just don't want too many phone calls. So like I said, we'll continue that annually. And then time 3.1 here, you'll see it's kind of what I call an action needed. That can happen between any of these time frames, between time 2, time 3, time 4. It's simply maybe we caught something, you know, with the client when we called them for follow-up. Maybe like I just had someone this morning, their foot was sliding off their foot plate. What I would do in that instance is we would reach out to the supplier or the clinic and let them know, hey, you know, this person needs some assistance with this. If they've reported new skin breakdown, we would definitely reach out to our main contact with that company. Maybe they had a score drop of 15% or more from their previous follow-up. And then also if they've been admitted to a facility due to a seating or mobility incident. So that can happen between any of those time frames. So we're kind of here as well to be an advocate for the supplier or the patient, where they're kind of another voice and to catch these issues as they come up.
That's great. Thank you, Tricia. So let me ask you a question, Tricia, for the group here. About how long does it take you to collect an FMA and UDS when you're doing a follow-up?
Yep, normally at that 21-day mark. Most times, you know, nowadays with telemarketers, things like that, people also screen their calls more often. So it does take a little bit of time. I would say on average, probably 3 phone calls to that client. We do leave them a voice message. If we absolutely cannot reach them by phone, even by email sometimes, that's rare, but we do email. We can also mail them out the follow-up assessment to their home. And hopefully when we do that, they'll fill it out and send it on back to us. There's quite a few. I would say we probably get about 30% back on mail, which is nice because, you know, a lot of people are just hard of hearing or, you know, just can't get to the phone in time. So mailing works as well.
That's great. So that's what I'd like to, what I will talk about a little bit is that we, from our perspective, we're doing this for outcome measures. This is also, you know, what we expected it to be too, as far as a quality assurance project, keeping track of people. I'm a clinician myself. We deliver expensive, complex wheelchairs. You know, we tend not to follow up. Follow up is just not built into what we do. and we should be doing it. This is just one way of where, Tricia, you mentioned you can catch things early on before they become problematic, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Good. So the other question is, like, when you actually do the phone call to complete the FMA and the UDS, how long is that taking approximately?
I think my shortest one I've ever done was 3 minutes and 28 seconds. And I think it's because I've spoken to that client like 5 times, so he already knows the questions that I'm going to ask. And then I think the longest one I've had is probably around 30 minutes, because people do get lonely, especially during the COVID season. We found a lot of people that just really wanted to talk. So some of those phone calls have dragged on a little bit, but on average, I would say 5 to 8 minutes.
Great. Okay, so it's not taking a long time, and that's the way we were hoping this would play out. So thank you for sharing that. Again, if anybody has questions or whatever, you can type them in the chat. I told Becky she could just interrupt our presentation, and we could answer them as we go along. But I guess that gives a sense of how this works. And what I like here with this relationship is that you know, Trisha's herself and a group of people are taking care of getting these follow-ups. And we're doing it for quality assurance purposes, but we're also doing it for other reasons too. And that leads into this slide here, is using an objective measure with some kind of score to it at a treatment level. That's a way to communicate with your consumer of how they're doing, and, you know, have things improved, you know, kind of on a case-by-case basis. So not only are you doing great, here are your grades, almost like when you're talking to your students. And then from a quality assurance perspective, this is becoming more important now, especially with accreditation and with other, you know, we're moving into this accountable care kind of environment now. You know, everybody's going to have some kind of metric they're using to keep track of people, making sure the treatments are working, that they're effective, and if they're not working, catching it sooner rather than later to avoid any, you know, or mitigate any potential hazardous situations. And you know, from a clinic management perspective, this is important. I like to know, you know, how is our clinic doing compared to the national averages? You know, what tends to be the expected outcome for a certain type of individual with a certain set of issues. But when all that data can be put into a large registry or a database, that gives us an incredible opportunity to start running analytics. And the reason why we went the direction of databases and registries versus, for instance, a lot of traditional research is more randomized clinical trials or cohorts. You just can't get your sample size big enough. And if you start running analytics and you're trying to see whether, you know, a certain intervention is effective, like a seat elevator perspective, if it's 25 people, there's so many covariants going on, and you've got dropouts and all the other issues. It's hard to run statistical analyses on it. And I think in the world of healthcare, you know, the randomized clinical trial has kind of been set as the gold standard, which I think is quite unfair. When you look at the types of interventions we do, we certainly can't randomize people. We certainly can't blind them. It's really an unethical way of doing treatment, of saying, you know, this group gets a wheelchair, this group doesn't get a wheelchair. But at the same time, they don't know whether they got a wheelchair or not. So it's just not a feasible option. And that's why registries are becoming very popular now, as long as everybody's willing to contribute to it. That's sort of what we all have to force ourselves to do, is, you know, it's time to measure outcomes. Let's just get it done.
Hey, Mark, we have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So someone asked which national suppliers are doing the FMA, and then we have another question about getting the FMA going in Canada.
Good question. So yes, right now US Rehab has initiated, but there are other suppliers doing it, and there are also a handful of clinics that are doing this just purely on their own without their supplier involvement. So either way, it can be done. Right now, when I show you the data, we've got actually right here, there's 350 clinical supplier participants contributing to the registry right now. So that's individual ATPs, both supplier and clinician. The majority of them are probably suppliers, mostly independents. So as far as doing it in Canada, we're certainly open to that. There's been some discussion about doing it. I think a lot of that discussion had a lot of momentum right before 2020. But we're certainly open to continue that discussion. Again, when we do introduce this in other countries, we've been using it in South America, for instance, we do have to make tweaks to the uniform data set, because how we describe, for instance, some of this is relevant internationally, but when you start talking about group 2 versus group 3 versus group 4, or K5s versus K4s, that doesn't have a lot of meaning to Canada. Fortunately, it doesn't, but and also other countries. So, is it good? Any other questions there, Becky?
Yeah, we have one question is, how do you find compliance with clinicians?
How do we find compliant? Well, if they sign up for this, they're most likely going to stick with it. Again, it's, none of us like to do more things, and that's why I always say, I developed the FMA. I'm not saying that, I'm the best at doing stuff, but at least, I'm a clinician. So I'm going to develop something that I know my colleagues are going to tolerate, versus if I was a full-time ivory tower PhD person, not to mock them, because I'm one of those 2 days a week. God knows what they would come up with. I've seen a lot of government assessments we have to do that are long, onerous, unmeaningful. I think we've all been there when our boss says you now have to do this. So compliance has been pretty good once people get on board. It's getting people to, kind of like swallow the oyster and let's do this, So, but we've got a good group going now. So, and afterwards, people can always reach out to me, and at the end, we'll have contact information if we want to use it. I know that US Rehab is letting clinicians use this tool at no cost. But that doesn't include sharing data. So you can collect your own data, do what you want with it, just use it clinically. But if you wanted to share it and then have Trish do all your follow-ups, that's where the cost comes in. But when you look at the cost, I don't know the price off the top of my head, but it was like a couple of $1,000s, which I would pay someone $20,000 to call all of our clients multiple times a year to make sure their equipment's working for them. So. Anything else?
One more question. Kyle asked, can suppliers or medical providers bill insurance for FMA calls?
Not right now, but when we move further into the world of accountable care, this kind of stuff will be built into the cost of equipment. Now, I know people are going to be rolling their eyes. We are working very carefully with some of our payers to understand that, there's value to what a CRT supplier does. And one of the things they do is that they track outcomes over time. So I know that some of the health plans that I'm working with, we're looking to build that not so much into the cost, but into what we call a pay for performance model. So in some instances, it could be a billing code, just like a repair code. In other instances, it could be a built into some kind of performance payments. So there's different ways that this is playing out. If we look at respiratory and diabetic care right now, that's the direction they're going in. So it's no longer the, selling what's in the box, it's selling the service of what's in the box. Anybody can sell what's in the box. It's who's going to keep track of it and make sure it's running correctly. So that's a kind of a paradigm shift. So, looking at just some global outcomes, the one that I'll bring up here. So this last analysis was done on a baseline of not a baseline of all the cases that have come out. The national average for time of assessment to time of delivery is this 98.7. We rerun that analysis. It's somewhere around 100 days, but let's just, to round things up, it takes about 100 days for someone to get a wheelchair from date of assessment to date of delivery. Getting the time to, which Tricia was talking about, we say that's like a 21-day or 30-day. It actually takes about 80 days to do that, which is fine. We just don't want people getting their follow-ups too soon, because we want to make sure there's some, that break-in period. And usually, around that time, they've used it long enough to give us a more accurate assessment of what their satisfaction with the device is and any problems they might be having with it. And then just other fun facts here, almost the average age of a person or average year of birth is 1958. So that puts them well into, the above 60 group. And of the 8,000 cases, we've got 2,300 where there was actually an ATP involved. The rest, it was either unknown or no ATP. And that's actually a paper that's going to be presented tomorrow. Over time, just for validation, baseline, people are scoring 28 or so out of 60. So that's, a 6-point scale times 10 items. And then at follow-up over time, it's staying pretty stable at about 53, 54. So people are satisfied at least up until this group 7, as Tricia was saying. We've got some clients now hitting their 5-year. So kind of this will start over again. Other fun facts, I guess, is who do we see? What's the diagnostic mix of the people we serve? 24% or so are what we call this other neuromuscular. We just can't get people to stop choosing that one, but we haven't gotten rid of it because it's still there. Mitochondrial disorders, a lot of congenital diseases fall into this. People are afraid to commit to a specific diagnosis like stroke or arthritis or CP, but stroke is probably the top reason, followed by osteoarthritis. If you combine spinal cord injury, para and tetra, that gets you up into 10%. So, the most common diagnoses for complex rehab would be stroke, osteoarthritis, CP, spinal cord injury, as well as all these other neuromuscular disorders. But amputation is at 6%, which is pretty high. MS is at 5.6. I thought that might be higher, but this is what the data is telling us. Cardiopulmonary is coming in here too, I would think, with a lot of metabolic syndrome type cases, and obviously obesity is at about 2.5% of the case mix in the data set. So fun things you can do with outcome measures and registries. If we look at just payer mix, and I'm comparing here 2018 to October of 2021, so 3 years. And again, I haven't run this statistically, just looking at it for the fun of it. High amount of Medicare, and you see that dropping. So it's going from like 50% straight Medicare down to 34%. You're also seeing an increase in Medicare managed care. So it's not that the patients are going away or the people are going away, they're shifting from one payer type to the next. And this is an interesting one because this is a way for us to forecast, what's our payer mix look like. When we looked at 2018, about 75% or more of the people that we're serving are falling into traditional Medicare, traditional Medicaid payers. And we've kind of all built our business around that. And then now you look at today, or closer to today, you're seeing a lot of people moving off straight Medicare and onto Medicare managed care. That's the ACOs, all the contractors out there, good or bad. We could have a whole other discussion on which one's better than the other. But I think what's important to know is that moving more to accountable care into, Medicare Advantage plans, Medicaid, HMOs, this is where, these companies look more carefully at who gets what, how they get it, and what is the value of this. Medicare itself, and it's not to knock them or anything, they have a pretty important job. If you look at Medicare policy for wheelchairs, it's horrible. And that's because they don't really give it much attention. They don't really care. Medicare Part B could care less what goes on in Medicare Part A. So if the patient falls more and ends up in the hospital, it's not my problem because I'm only responsible for B. I know that sounds harsh, but A and B are two different silos in the United States, and there's no coordination. Move over to accountable care. Now they're starting to care about these things. So they may want to pay closer attention to what type of equipment, under what circumstances, what's going to work best for what people, because at the end of the day, we get X amount of dollars per person per month. And if we can spend as little of that as possible on hospitalizations and more expensive things, but rather do preventative care, okay, then we're going to listen to that. And that's where stuff like what we're doing here with the FMA is going to play an important role. Again, fun facts, 53% of CRT users are female, 47% male. So there is a difference. You could hypothesize why that is. Women live longer, perhaps, but that's just what the numbers are telling us. Here's just looking at FMA scores at time 1, time 2. You can see before we were saying it's an over 100% jump in satisfaction. If you wanted to put it on a bell curve, you can see, you know, 2 skewed bell curves, scores going up significantly on the follow-up. Equipment at baseline is interesting, and then equipment at follow-up. Again, baseline is coming in for a new wheelchair. Some of them got them through an ATP. Some of them got them through just a PCP prescription and went to the local drugstore. Some of them, we don't know where they got them from, but we at least know at baseline who's using what type of equipment. And when you look at the table over here, canes, crutches, walkers, 23% at baseline, no canes, crutches, well, 0.03. So a couple of people kept their cane, crutches, walkers, I guess. Ultralight K5 manual wheelchairs went from about 8% to over 16, so that doubled. Scooters up significantly. That's about a 300 to 400% increase. So lots of scooters being provided, but it makes up about 11.5% or 12% of the registry population. Group 2 power chairs went from 10% to 30%, so that's a 300% jump. And then group 3 chairs went from 11% to 34%, so that's another 300% jump. So it's fun to see what the shift in what's being provided to people once they finally get to a clinic or to a CRT supplier. So again, how they get this chair is most likely under best practice circumstances, because the data would not be in the registry per se if there was not an ATP involved. So one of the flaws of the study is we still don't know what happens to the people that don't see ATPs, although we can use our baseline of non-ATP equipment to say, you know, this is what is typically going to happen to a person if you give them a cane crutch walker when perhaps they really need a scooter, or you're giving them a group 2 chair when they actually probably need a group 3, because ATPs are the only ones that can provide group 3. Or if we had more data in here about group 4s, then we would really be able to say, you know, more conclusively, statistically, scientifically, you know, that there is value to group 4. It's not just a high cost piece of equipment that's designed to go outdoors. So, and going outdoors is important. So accessories is another thing that we can see from the data. At baseline, there's quite a few chairs, and I know my little window's in the way there, but it was about 40% or 50% of chairs. Well, thank you. Whoa, higher than that. I think I should know my data better. 76% of devices at baseline have no accessory. And when we talk about accessories, that means either tilt, recline, power legs, seat elevator, and then we added power assist in here. And you can see, you know, the lighter line is the follow-up. At follow-up, there's only 34% not with an accessory on the chair. And that could be because you still got a lot of people using group 2s and scooters and manual chairs. So it's not anything to be concerned about. Power assist went from like 0.4% to 1.6%. Still not a high number. Again, it's as a database grows, maybe that'll change. Maybe we'll look at it a little differently. Okay, but I think the main thing here is we're seeing a lot more increase in tilt, recline, elevating leg rest, and even seat elevator, you know, at 3.4% baseline and up to 7.5. So it has doubled. So, you know, for a feature that's not covered by most insurance, it's being provided. So that's why I always challenge us is like, just because it's not covered by insurance doesn't mean that it's not something we consider, offer, talk to our customers about as options. You never know. There's always alternative ways to fund things. So knowing what's happening with people from time 1, there we go. Good.
Mark, we have a quick question related to follow-up. Someone asked, how many follow-ups do you have in place? And what is the response rate?
Let me see. Do we have that slide in here, Rich? It's all the way at the beginning. Okay. I don't want to go back because I'll never find my way forward. Like Trish was saying, we're follow-up attrition rate is about 50%. So if we have, and maybe I got Rich sitting right next to me because he knows the data too. If we have 10,000 baselines, I would say we have like 3,800, 3,500 follow-ups. So we have I would say a 35%, but that number fluctuates obviously. And I would say, and Trish, you can chime in here too. Once we get past the time 2, if they responded, they usually stay with us.
Correct.
So, yeah. And you know, and that's the reality of doing follow-ups, right? National average return on research follow-up is like 17%, maybe it's 20%. I think ours is actually higher, but you're right. That does, you know, that's a weakness of a study when we do our research. And most of our follow-ups, or most of the follow-ups that we don't hear, is just lost to follow-up. Just cannot get a hold of them. As far as condition, a lot of them are condition has changed, situation has changed. Most of them are not showing up at time 2 because they never got their equipment, which unfortunately we haven't found a way to find that out, which I would be more than happy to receive that data. So if it's denied by insurance, for instance, I think that is critical information to know, especially if I'm an accountable care organization. So if this person didn't get their power wheelchair or their scooter because we denied it, I want to know what happens to that person over time. But unfortunately, we lose them. So, yeah. So here we go with, yep, go ahead, Becky. Is there another question?
No more questions.
All right. Well, keep them coming. We've got another 20 minutes or so. This was just looking at cushions. So before we talked about accessories, and now we're looking at cushions. What's interesting here is no cushion at baseline. 55% of people coming in with no cushion. Now that could be they're using a cane crutch walker. That could be because they're using a captain style seat, but that would show up here. So captain style seat actually triples, but then we're also seeing a 300% increase in group 2s and scooters in this data set also. Sling seat, you know, about 8%, 8%, and almost no sling seats at follow-up. General use cushion stays about the same. Skin protection goes up a little bit, but really where you're seeing the biggest jump here, again, about 300%, is your skin protection and positioning cushions. Those of you that are not working in the US, that's going to be your cushion that has both, you know, for instance, if it was an air cushion, it would be air and foam or a combination of materials to provide both pressure relief and positioning. Excuse me. So custom fabricated cushions is still really a small sample here, but the no cushion is an interesting one. So when we look at what people are getting and how they're getting it and what's on the chair, let's look at some outcomes here. So falls, everybody says, oh, we prevent falls. Okay, I don't disagree with that. If you don't give someone the device they need, like a scooter or a group 2, and they're walking with their canes, crutches, walkers, they're more likely to fall and hurt themselves. And what's interesting here is the number of reported no falls at baseline was only like 42%. But we also have to note down here that a lot of people didn't know whether they fell or not, or they're maybe don't want to report it. So let's assume all of them were no falls. It's still 52%. And at follow-ups, you're seeing, you know, around 80% are reporting no falls. What we're not seeing here is a 1 to 2 time falls difference. Now it's lower. It dropped from, you know, 25% down to 16%, back up to 19%. But I think what's important to note here is the you know, what we call the frequent fallers. So people who are falling 3 to 4 times or 5 or more times is what's going down. So one fall may not be as much of a change, but we're seeing change when it gets into more than 2 falls. And again, this is self-report. So again, you take it with a grain of salt. Not everybody reports accurately, but when your sample is at 1,500, no one's going to dismiss that this isn't true, or that, 1,500 people are lying. Well, not necessarily. Some are lying. Some of them are not admitting. But when we see that change, we know that we're making some kind of positive outcome. So same with pressure sores. This is another one. We say we prevent pressure sores. So people reporting no pressure sores, 81% goes up to 93%. Again, we have 5% that was unsure. And yes, pressure sore at baseline is almost 12%. That goes down to 5%. Now, this is a good outcome. We like to look at this, but pressure sores is something that's hard to measure sometimes. Or does our intervention make a difference? A lot of people using CRT have pressure sores. They always will have pressure sores. We did recently run a correlation analysis to see what the relationship was. So people using skin protection, positioning cushions, were also the people that had the highest incidence of pressure sores. That doesn't mean that there's a cause-effect relationship. As I always say, correlation does not equal causation. But what we are seeing here, again, with 1,500 people, is a decrease in pressure sores, or an increase in people reporting no pressure sores. And that's what's important. This is a recent analysis of the data done by one of our students, Ricky. And he ran a box plot of what FMA scores looked like based on type of equipment used. This is all at baseline. Now, these samples are independent, so there's not large numbers. Like group 4 power wheelchairs is only an N of 25 compared to, say, group 2 power chairs where you're going to have hundreds. But what's interesting here is that the more advanced the technology at baseline, the more higher the FMA scores are. So it kind of goes in order here. Group 4s had the highest FMA scores, group 3, followed by ultralights. This is a bogey here. Not sure. Group 1 power chairs, there's 50 of them, followed by group 2. And what's really interesting as a clinician, that the people who had cane crutches walkers scored higher than people using those depot standard wheelchairs. So clinically, does this have meaning? Yeah. Statistically, we're still working on it, but I guess you could say that you can get around better with a cane crutch walker than you can a K1 wheelchair. So it's harder to push. And clinically, I'd like to say, we discharge people from inpatient rehab. We send them home in a wheelchair that they can't push. There's probably other factors going on too, but if they can't push the chair, then guess what? They're going to get out of it and they're going to try to walk because that's easier, and then they're going to fall again. Ricky ran the analysis for the follow-up, and everybody scored high. It didn't matter what they got, even the canes, crutches, walkers. You would think that everybody had an ATP involved. Why are there still standard wheelchairs, and why are there still canes, crutches, walkers? Well, that's probably because it's not a high proportion, but that's because whoever the ATP and the therapists were decided that that was the right piece of equipment for that person at that time. It doesn't mean that just because you see an ATP, you're going to get a group 3 or a group 4 power wheelchair with all these seat functions. So I think that's a good outcome, demonstrating what we do and that it results in the outcomes. This other analysis was done by Max Cuppet. He had just graduated last year. We were looking at service cycle times to get equipment. So before I was telling you, it was about 100 days from eval to delivery. He reran the analysis with a larger sample. That's at 101.5 days. Now, standard deviation here is 60. That means that it's wide. It's a very broad, those are not what we call tight standard deviations at all. But so that's where the means and averages, when we just look at them. He ran some statistical analysis on this. He's in the process of publishing it. So you'll read that when it comes out in the journal. But what's interesting to this, and again, validates what we do clinically, the devices that you can get the quickest are scooters at 78 days, non-customizable manual wheelchairs at 89 days, manual wheelchairs that are custom take 117. Group 2 power chairs only take 84 days, but he was putting them in sequential order here. The more complex the device, usually the longer you're going to be waiting. And if this banner wasn't in the way, the bottom one would say Group 4 power chairs. Yeah, 137, we'll just say 140 days to round it out. And Group 3 power wheelchairs, 112 days. So, why is that happening? It could be a number of reasons. It could be clinicians take longer to get their documentation done. It may take an insurance reviewer longer to review it. It may take a supplier longer to order the parts and assemble them. We haven't broken it down to look at it specifically because we also know, whoops, I'm kind of locked up here, Rich. There we go. Oh, no, not yet. There we go. He broke it down. Let's just look at power across that payer mix. And you could see the blue, red, gray, I think that's orange. That's your scooter, your Group 1, or sorry, your Group 2 and your Group 3. Yeah, Group 3, Group 4. Group 4s obviously take longer across most of these payers. So it's not like that one payer takes longer than another, because you're still seeing a very similar trend. The more simple the device, the shorter the the time cycle is from eval to delivery, and the more complex. And again, these are independent samples. These are all different people, but what's constant in that group is their payer. The independent variable here is, what payer is it? Medicaid managed care. And when you run this analysis, you're not finding much difference. Did the same thing with manual chairs. So we broke manual chairs down into non-customizable. So that would be your depot K1s all the way up to K4. And then your customizable would be all your K4. Well, actually, your non-customizable would also be your K6, K7s, which are your bariatric devices, which are basically just heavy-duty K1 wheelchairs. This is going to include, your custom is going to include your ultralights, and then your custom manual tilt and space wheelchairs. And you can see here, for some reason, private insurance is the same, but again, statistically, we don't know, because he's running that analysis and he's about to publish it. So with that, this is all just summary now, and we're kind of done. The infrastructure's in place, it's working. Tricia and her group have done a fantastic job of populating it with the follow-up information. The fact that we've hit a couple now where the devices are 5 years old. My goal as a researcher would be to have 10,000 cases that have gone through the complete life cycle of the wheelchair. That way we really be able to dig in to see what happens to the devices over time. Some of the other things that I'd really like to dig into, and we're going to, is looking at repair cycles. When do parts get replaced? When do they break? So that we can move forward into a model where maintenance and repair and outcomes and all this great stuff we're talking about is recognized as value, is included in costs and payment. Some of the sessions we've even seen, like this morning, listening to like Barry Dean talk about his experience as a parent. I mean, we as ATPs, clinicians, suppliers, manufacturers, really carry a lot of responsibility, and people who look to us to get this equipment are extremely vulnerable and extremely dependent on us providing them with accurate information. No different than you or your loved one is going to the hospital with a catastrophic injury or sickness, whether it's cancer or a tumor or all sorts of things, or COVID in this case. You want to know what treatment's going to work best for me or my loved one. And the best way to do that is, yes, clinical intuition from experienced clinicians who are being very truthful, or also add to that large data sets that show what devices work best for what people. And it just makes the whole system a lot more transparent. We're not arguing. Someone always said, if you have data, you don't have to shout. That's true. And I'll tell you, some of these analytics that we've shared so far with payers, including our own payers here in Pittsburgh, I've said, wow, this is exactly what we're looking for. This is exactly telling us who you are and what you do. So on the prevention side, keeping people out of the hospitals, if that's truly what we do, then we need to prove that more than just say that. And we move in the direction of getting more respect and also being more accountable. So there's also a bunch of publications. If you want to look for the publications, you can find it. That's the easiest thing to do. If you don't have PubMed, just go to Google Scholar. You can search my name or Rich's name, and it'll come up with all the publications that have been put in the scientific literature. So more information is the fma.pitt.edu website, or you can go to US Rehab. And with that, we are still good for some questions, comments, complaints.
There was one comment from Patricia who said, I'd like to see Medicaid DDA clients get these kinds of regular phone calls. It would help with clients, families, and case managers immensely.
Yep, could not agree. Thank you for that comment. That's good. Yeah, I mean, it's the reason I kind of got into it is I've always said, wow, and I've heard this from payers. We put people in $30,000, $40,000 complex devices, and we provide no follow-up, and we only fix things once they break. We provide no maintenance. We do nothing to check to see that it's working. And then we wait for something to go wrong and it becomes a crisis. It sounds like just bad medicine to me.
And then a few kind of follow-up questions. One to that was, would you see DDA contracting with a third-party group to do the follow-up?
Yes, I think that's what part of the reason why we brought US Rehab into this. We'd worked with all the suppliers at that time. Greg and his group were kind of like the early adopters, kind of like AT&T went with the iPhone before everybody else did, is the way I describe it. So I know that as a clinic, I certainly wouldn't want to be the one doing all these follow-ups. I work very closely with all of our suppliers, New Motion, NSM, US Rehab. They certainly don't have the resources to do it. So this is where I think you can just outsource it. The other thing too is we're going to be automating this as much as we can. There are some clients that do well with online follow-ups and checkups. And then there's other people that need a telephone call. We started with the telephone call, and that's what Trish is doing, because that was sort of like, the lower common denominator. We know everybody will at least answer the phone. Except now that I think about it, there's a flaw there, because I know anybody under the age of 20 doesn't answer the phone. You have to text them. Or maybe it's 25, but yeah, no, I see it as being something that gets outsourced. So you just get the report, and then you just share that report with your stakeholders, whether it's a joint commission, your CEO, your customers, kind of like what FIM scores do or did.
And then one last question. Any plans to use this data to create some clinical practice guidelines?
Thank you. That's a whole other reason for doing it. It's if you look at like the Resna position paper on ultralight wheelchairs, the one that we're just finishing up on the wheelchair service guide. These are all places where, so what you do is you get the data, and then you run the analytics, you publish the results, and then that leads to clinical implications. Those clinical implications then lead to clinical practice guidelines, which then leads to policy, which is a very long road, but it's exactly the whole purpose of this. It's data-driven, evidence-based practice guidelines. So right now, unfortunately, we succumb to, it's not a practice guideline, it's a policy. Medicare says You don't need an ultralight. You don't need a group 4 chair. You don't need a seat elevator. I mean, that's a bunch of malarkey. The only reason they're saying that is because there are people that stole money. And yes, people do steal money. They rip off the government every day, all day. And are there people in the wheelchair industry that have done that? Yes, many. Is that still a problem today as much as it was in the past? I don't think so. But we still live in the world of, the payer and the provider are just constantly at odds with each other. And in the middle, you have the consumer and the clinician trying to help the consumer. And it's like mom and dad keep arguing and we can't get what we need. So yes, data hopefully will help allow the payer and the provider to play more nicely.
And then we have some people who are interested in kind of similar to the question about Canada earlier, particularly in Ireland and Argentina, some individuals who are interested in getting it into their countries.
Yeah, so if you're in Latin America, Ana Allegretti is leading up the project. It's the Latin American FMA project. I think she already spoke earlier today. She would be the contact person. Like I said, if you're anywhere else, we're letting, our VGM is letting people use the tool clinically as much as they want at no cost, which makes sense. But again, if you want someone doing the follow-ups and analyzing your data for you, that there is a cost associated with that. So best to do is just to go to vgm.com and or to this website and just put in a query. It's basically just having to sign a user license agreement. And that's more for us just to keep track of who's using it. Because the cost associated with is really about Trisha's time and her team to do the follow-ups, and then also sending all the data to the University of Pittsburgh. We have to pay for those resources. No one's making a whole ton of money off this, I'll tell you that. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do, but we have to keep it kind of as budget neutral as possible. So with 3 minutes left.
All righty.
I just want to say, I think the conference is going great.
Mm-hmm.
That's just, if I could, for 3 minutes, just say, Rich here next to me has done a phenomenal job. The whole team, Becky, your group with the volunteers, it's been hardly, at least I'm not seeing any problem. Maybe you're just all doing a good job of hiding it, but I haven't seen any issues. And I will say, if you haven't gone to the virtual exhibit hall, please do so. I was a skeptic about a virtual exhibit hall. And then when we thought about how can we do this, and it was great to go in and see these kind of live demos. I'm kind of a standoffish person when it comes to the exhibit hall anyways, where I just kind of like to lurk in the corner a little bit and then slowly warm up. But yeah, no, I think it for a virtual conference, we couldn't have asked for a better situation.
And
So.
I have put the CEU code into the chat box, and I will say it out loud as well. It is U8WPER. And then I will let Mark close us out.
Yeah, thank you. And so tomorrow morning, we're talking about large data, friend or foe, or threats or opportunities. So that's a plenary session tomorrow morning at 8:30. All right, well, thank you all, and please enjoy the rest of the ISS and take some time to go to the exhibit hall.